Okay, welcome back everyone. We're moving on to the first roundtable event of this conference, and it's wonderful to see so many friendly faces, so many people that we work together closely, but I must admit I'm a little nervous today because my parents are in the audience. It's the first time they've ever seen me on stage, so no pressure, no pressure. But now we're also going to talk about a topic that is not necessarily something that is usually discussed in this particular forum, and that is space security. I can already hear the Darth Vader theme song playing in the background. Usually when I come into the room, everybody says, okay, Daniel's coming in to talk about the weaponization of outer space again. My name is Daniel Porras. I am the Space Security Fellow at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and we do deal with space security. Now, two of the big topics that we often deal with in the UN is safety and security. Today, mostly what we've been discussing so far is safety, and that is freedom from occurrences that are unintentional, things that we don't expect to happen and that no one intended to happen. Security, on the other hand, has to deal with intentional occurrences. What are the things that people want to take place that you may or may not want to avoid? And that includes the potential weaponization of outer space. One of the things that we look at in the United Nations, it's an agenda item called the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And lately, if anybody's been watching the news, we're finding it increasingly difficult to say that we are not in an arms race and that it doesn't involve outer space. So what we're going to talk about today with these panelists, Victoria and Ulpia, unfortunately Maria's not here, but I understand she is watching. We're going to talk a little bit about what space traffic management can do for security. Even if it's something that we ordinarily look at it from the safety perspective, does it have any security benefits or other benefits that could help to ease the tensions between rivals in outer space? And let's face it, right now, relationships between certain major space powers are not at their best. So, with that, first, I would like to introduce Ulpia Botezatu. Sorry. She's a researcher on security and defense at the Romanian Space Agency and is project manager on a project on space-critical infrastructure. After that, we will have some words from Victoria Sampson, who is the director of the Washington office for the Secure World Foundation, and she's going to tell us a little bit about co-orbital vehicles and some of the security concerns we have with those. We were supposed to have another presenter, Ms. Maria Lucas Rimbasson. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Toulouse on space law and policy. Unfortunately, she couldn't be with us. However, she did make her presentation available. We're going to put it online so that if you want to see her PowerPoint, as well as the audio that goes along with it, you can look it up. But with that, I would like to hand over first to Ulpia.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. So I'm working for the Romanian Space Agency, and I'm more on the security and defense part. I'm more into the SSA, Space Situational Awareness, and I'm delegate to a couple of bodies and committees related to SSA and SST. What I'm planning to talk about today are some transformational challenges to space sector, and I will take the example of Romania as much as I can. Unfortunately, Daniel gave me only 10 minutes, so more details are going to be in the paper about Romania's activity. So I want to talk about, highlight actually three major themes when discussing space security and what are the implications of thinking space security in small and medium-sized countries such as Romania. So I will talk about terminology as a challenge, governance as a challenge, and maybe not the best word, but I don't know how else to call it, but about space forces. So just to say a bit that Romania through Romanian Space Agency, participates to all major international programs on space security, the UN COPOS, European Space Agency SSA optional program. It is part of the European Union Space Surveillance and Tracking Consortium, and also participates to several NATO space resilience working groups and committees, European Defence Agencies programs, as well as numerous other bilateral and multilateral agreements aiming at the peaceful use of outer space. So I would like to start with my first theme, that is terminology. I will refer mostly to the SSA, SST, STM terminology. When we discuss about security and when we discuss about terms, concepts, we actually create realities. And for a country as small as Romania, and probably for many others, When it comes to transmuting the work of numerous international bodies and committees into national legislation, it actually gets difficult. Not only because it's about translating words, but it's because the meaning should fit the already existing institutional network and organizational culture in the home countries. So for countries whose national language is different than the main international working language, as Romanian, translating terms in the right way could be at times quite challenging. For instance, safety and security, and these are two terms which have been widely referred to beforehand. However, terminology and vocabulary does not only refer to terms, but also combinations, having or creating particular meanings. So, for instance, the European Union differentiates between security from space and security from outer space. Space-based assets and systems are critical to ensuring security on Earth. That is called security from space. At the same time, these assets need to be protected in the difficult environment of outer space, which is security of space. But, you know, European Union is actually formed of 27 states after Brexit, and therefore there are 27 languages that have to find their own terminologies. That is one thing. And then the European Union formed an SST consortium, and actually my colleague Arik is from Polscience here. He can discuss later on more on that. Is a consortium formed of member states, which uses pooling and sharing international capabilities of member states to provision of services of collision avoidance, re-entry and fragmentation to European users. And in European Union's SSA terminology, there is a supportive framework entitled European Space Surveillance and Tracking Support Framework that it is established as a result of the impulse of the Lisbon Treaty in 2014. And EU with that got a new space policy mandate. At that time, only isolated initiative existed, that is Franco-German mostly, and the use of space surveillance and tracking radars were kind of blurry. It became now generalized to the 8 member states, which also have to find their own understanding of policy on one hand side and then an organizational framework. Then there is the European Space Agency Space Situational Awareness Program, which is an optional program and is financed by participation of 19 member states, began in 2009, and then it has been extended to, it extended to 95 billion euros through 2020. So under this program, Europe is acquiring independent capability to watch for objects and natural phenomena that could harm satellites in orbit or infrastructure, such as power grids on the ground. So to achieve this, ESA is focusing on space weather, near-Earth objects, and space surveillance and tracking again. Then Romania also participates to NATO, and NATO has an evolving interest and concern for space framed under the space domain awareness. But NATO is not a one-nation state. It consists of 29 independent member countries and does not own assets in space, but it relies on member states' capabilities to support operations. And these operations are relying on the adequate provisioning of critical space services, and adversaries seek to disrupt this access in order to limit NATO capabilities. So space is a new operational domain alongside land, sea, air, and cyber, and NATO must consider how to fight in and through the contested space environment. Then there is the dual use or the multi-use issue that permeates space systems and technologies. And again, we are going back to operational issues with legal, jurisdictional, political, ethical, environmental consideration for each member state. So Romania participates to all these programs, and it has its own financial contribution, and at the same time, it has its own national interests and ambitions. At the same time, it doesn't have the power of states such as the US or France. Thus, it needs to mold various interests, but also it needs to survive various conflicts as well. As monitoring and understanding real-time foreseeable events from outer space underwent various terminology transformation from space situational awareness, space domain awareness, space surveillance and tracking, space traffic management, it introduced the confusion that delays somehow the application of laws and procedures. Consequently, there is in Romania, a lot of ambiguity surrounding terminology on various layers. That is one intergovernmental level at, say, the United Nations or European Space Agency. Then there is another layer of supranational institutions, EU, European Union, or Space Events and Tracking Consortium. Then there is a terminology related to military institutions relying on member states' capabilities like NATO or European Defense Agency. Then there is a lot of confusion at the governmental level, even on individual member states or through bilateral agreements. So for small and medium-sized countries such as Romania, the debates happening on the intergovernmental level still need to find their expression on space and to be moderated between various institutional frameworks and vocabularies on the domestic front. So this being said, I would like to turn to the second point that I want to make about governance. So outer space has long been perceived as solely the realm of astrophysicists, while security was more the realm of political sciences. However, it is interesting to see how these two realms are intersecting, interacting, and are supposed to transform each other when discussing about space security. And of course, this issue gets divided between artificial and natural, accidental and deliberate space hazards. The institutions that I mentioned before hold various models of interaction. So member states on one hand hold various interests which are not always completely transparent. So since outer space is a global common, countries of the world attempt to regulate its usage. Nevertheless, building consensus is still at its beginnings. The multi-use nature of space assets makes it possible that even civilian operation can advance military aims or affect, to a certain degree, geopolitical relations among member states. Moreover, it gets difficult to categorize civilian and military activities and to distinguish between aggressive and offensive intentions in outer space. Thus, governance of space assets gets really blurry. Then there are various models of governance. Most of governance models start from setting up laws and institutions. However, the European Union Space Events and Tracking Consortium starts from operational framework. And when we talk about that, is actually a network of joining existing sensors of European member states, and that provide, as I said, collision avoidance, re-entry and fragmentation analysis for European user community. But however, the governance model is outside the country's border. On the domestic level, what I said about mediating vocabulary is also valid for mediating institutions. And I will refer to the model of Romania as internal governance, its internal governance with regards to space domain. So Romanian Space Agency, again, is the national designated entity to coordinate all space-related activities, including research, but also security and defense aspects. So for instance, ROSA coordinates various working groups at institutional level. One more point. Some of them purely military or intelligence-related. And within these working groups, both vocabulary and decision-making is transmuted from civilian to military establishments and from strategic to operational level in order to be mediated and to create a common unitary perspective among various ministries, departments, or even humans. So my last point is on space forces, and I was going to say about this tendency in the international arena of creating space forces that actually send a sign on visible increase in space funding, on growing tensions and concerns, and on heavily investing in military space capabilities. However, when we discuss space, it's not only what happens out there, but also aspects which seems minor have like a meaning, have a vocabulary, and the organizational procedures would have to follow forwards. Thank you, and sorry for extending my speech. Thank you, and looking forward to your comments and questions.
Great. Thank you, Lapia. Actually, I really want to dive into that third point that you were making, but we'll do that as we continue the conversation. And that's really what we want to do here. I'd like to keep this more conversational, so audience, have your questions and comments ready so that you can engage with these really great experts up here. So next, I'd like to turn over to Victoria, who's going to talk a little bit about co-orbital vehicles.
Okay. Hello. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. For those of you who aren't familiar with my organization, we're a private nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We push for best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is usable to and accessible for all over the long term. I was asked to talk a little bit about close approach and how that affects both space security and space traffic management writ large. One of the issues that comes up a lot is the idea, looking at the evolution of the use of space through rendezvous and proximity operations, through active debris removal, just general close approaches. These do provide security challenges and concerns that affect space traffic management as well. For one, any object that can get close to another object could threaten it, or you could infer a threat, so that the possibility of destabilizing the space domain. As you all know, we don't have a really strong picture of what's going on in orbit. There are a lot of pixels we see, but a lot of it is just guesswork, educated guesswork, based on patterns of behavior, like TS talked about earlier. And so there is a possibility that a misunderstanding, a miscomprehension, or the idea that someone's a bad actor could lead to a security challenge or have space threats in space come down on Earth. And there's a real need for this. We're seeing as one of the evolutions of the use of space is the launch of mega constellations. These are starting. Right now, I think SpaceX is going to have 300 satellites up soon, makes them one of the biggest constellation operators. Right now, there's about 2,200 active satellites. If you look at what these operators are predicting that they would like to launch, you could have 50,000 new satellites. It's probably not all going to happen, but it's going to be a significant amount. And the concern, many concerns for space traffic management, but one is no matter how good these are, a certain percentage of these satellites are not going to work. So if you have 50,000, you have 1 or 2% of that, that's a fairly large number. What are you going to do about that? And that's where things like active debris removal and close approach are going to be incredibly important to make sure that space is usable to all, and that's where space traffic management ties in. And the other thing that's a challenge coming up for that is that space as a shared domain has historically been talked about in multilateral fora, i.e. nation states. They're the ones that get together and talk about this, the United Nations, it's in its name. However, when you look at who is actually doing the launch of these mega constellations, it's not countries, it's commercial actors. So you're going to a point where you have commercial actors, stakeholders, who don't have any way to give input or access to the multilateral system they're discussing it. It's a real challenge, because how can you solve this problem if you can't get the people involved in the problem in the room together? So it's going to be an issue. In the few minutes I have left of my time, TS also talked about the need for establishing patterns of behavior in order to figure out what's normal, what's not normal. In order for that to happen, you need to figure out, okay, well, what's normal? You guys may have seen out front, there's a handbook for new actors in space. My organization put out, it's available also on our website as a PDF. The reason why we put it together is we didn't want to make an encyclopedia on how to launch a satellite. But really, when we were talking to new actors, both countries who are new to space and just new actors, academic institutions, companies, things like that, so you want to launch a satellite, what do you actually need to know? And so we split it into 3 categories. First of all, international legal regime. There's a thing called the Outer Space Treaty. You might want to be aware of that. If you're going to be broadcasting, the ITU is important as well. The second section talks about national regulatory mechanisms. If you're launching, someone in your country needs to give you a launch license. If you're going to be broadcasting, someone needs to figure out spectrum allocation. So these are just kind of highlighting the issues. And then the third section is technical operational best practices from birth to death, or let's say end of life. Maybe that's better. So the idea was, again, we didn't want to violate any export control concerns, but just generally speaking, the idea, what are the best practices for these sort of things? So again, that's available on our website, and if you have interest in it, please contact me. I'm happy to get you more copies. Another issue that was brought up, the idea of establishing patterns of behavior. There's been a lot of discussion about counter space capabilities, whether it's close approach on orbit, or in space weapons parlance, it's called co-orbital, or any direct some sort of anti-satellite weapon, deliberate jamming, any of those things. So Secure World put together a counter space threat document, which again is available out front and also on our website, where we said, okay, what do we actually know about counter space capabilities? What do we know about close approaches? So when things happen like the Russian satellite that's reportedly approaching US satellites, is that actually unusual, or is that just something that a lot of countries have the capability for? Short answer, US and China do it as well. It's not just the Russians. But the problem with space security issues is they get classified so quickly. I used to work on nuclear weapons issues, and I promise you, space security gets classified so much faster than nuclear weapons. And so it's frustrating. How can you have a conversation where you're actually looking at what is the actual threat when you aren't allowed to speak except in vague, hyperbolic discussion points about what the space threats are? And so what we wanted to do is put together what can you actually find in the public domain on these space capabilities. And we took 5 different areas looking at counter space capabilities, including close approach. And said, okay, for US, for Russia, for China, for India, for North Korea, for Iran, what do we actually know versus what is implied? And we try to just say, okay, we're not going to give any recommendations, anything like that. And one of the things that I really like about our document, if I may continue this advertisement a minute further, is that we included the United States. We wanted to have a holistic discussion of the threat because, let's be honest, in the West, and particularly the United States, when we talk about counter-space capabilities, we only focus on Russia and China. And so if you don't know any better, you look at it, you're like, oh my God, the US is completely undefended. What are we going to do? That's not actually the truth. So that's available as well. And then really quickly wrapping up, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the role of the commercial sector in establishing these patterns of behavior and identifying what the best practices are for close approach. There has been an interest lately in solidifying what it perceives to be the best practices and guidances for the safe and sustainable use of space, which is fantastic. Historically, the commercial sector has been like, hands off, get the government out of my work. I'm just trying to make money here. I don't need you guys involved. But the commercial sector is actually realizing, look, if we want our systems to succeed, we need to have an environment that's stable and predictable. And it's to our benefit to be part of that conversation. And so there's been a couple things released over the past year or so that's been really interesting just to see how this has evolved. The first one is the Consortium for Rendezvous and Servicing Operations, or CONFERS. That's a DARPA-funded project where they have 35 members. These are all commercial actors, international, not just the United States, getting together and talk about what they perceive to be the best practices for rendezvous and proximity ops, so they can get it down on paper. Full disclosure, Secure World is on the executive committee of that. We've been able, not we, but the CONFERS organization has actually made some progress. They've been able to come up with guiding principles. They've been able to recommend design and operational best practices. And they've been able to do description of on-orbit mission phases, which are all fantastic. And in fact, they're trying to get some of the stuff ISO certified. So there's been real progress in this. The second one is a Space Safety Coalition. Dan Altrighi is the executive director of that. It's a living document where the signatories agree to have best practices for the safety of space operations. So again, they're just trying to establish what they perceive to be the best practices. And then finally, Satellite Industry Association released Principles of Space Safety for the Commercial Satellite Industry. So again, there's just a real appetite, and again, Teresa's here if anyone wants to talk more. Yeah. Waving her hand wildly. So if anyone wants to talk more about that. So I think these are all really encouraging milestones. But it does indicate that there is a responsibility to consider others. There is a responsibility to build into the design process what the best practices are in order to make sure that space traffic management is evolving to meet the domain that we currently have and that we like to have in the future. And so with that, I think I'm at time, so I'll stop.
Okay, now we get to sit around at this, what do they call these, fireside chats?
Sort of. No fire.
I'd like to open the floor to the audience, but before that, taking the prerogative of the moderator, I have a couple of zingers to throw at our speakers. Pia, I've got one for you first. As I'm sure a lot of you saw, and as you discussed earlier, NATO has designated space as a domain of operation. They've also indicated that an attack on a NATO satellite or of a satellite that belongs to an ally is sufficient to trigger collective self-defense. Well, my question is, what is an attack? And is there any consensus among the NATO states on what is an attack? And does Romania have a position on what is an attack on a satellite?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I don't think I'm actually the right person to answer military terminology, though. I think Romania, as a member state as a member of NATO and as a member state of many other institutions and bodies, will have to somehow, balance its own interests with the community interests. And I don't think, in terms of an attack to a satellite, as far as I know, maybe I don't know, I don't think we actually have a definition. Romanian definition of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Victoria?
I won't talk about NATO, but just the idea of what is designated attack. That's a really good question because I don't think the national community has really decided what they determine to be an attack. There have been a couple different ongoing, I'll say, complementary projects to establish how the laws of armed conflict apply to space. One is the Millimos Manual, and the other one is the Woomera Manual, and they're hopefully going to come to fruition this year, maybe. The idea of talking about international humanitarian law applies to that, and what do you designate attack, and what's considered appropriate response, and any of those sort of things. So they're working on it, but there's still a lot of questions up in the air.
Yeah, I think there is probably some consensus that if you blow up somebody else's satellite, that's probably an attack. But I think there is a lot of question at the moment about things like jamming or spoofing or even potentially hacking space systems that still haven't been clarified. So hopefully we'll see a little bit more. We'll see that congeal a little bit better, so that people have an idea of what some of these limits are.
Yeah, because let's be honest, we're doing it now. We are jamming satellites now. It is happening now, and that's one of the concerns. If you create this red line, you need to understand this is happening now. And in fact, if you look at the Secure World's counter-space threat document, the too long didn't read version is that don't worry about kinetic ASATs, worry about jamming, because that's happening now. We don't know what to do about it.
Okay. Victoria, you also you brought up the issue of industry working with states to try and come up with some norms of behavior and different rules. But with security questions, this is often just left to ministries of defense or the Defense Department. How do you see industry being able to engage on security as opposed to safety issues?
I think it requires a change in the culture about what they view as their responsibility, because you're right, they typically do not like to talk about that. But I think also when we talk about, another change needs to be made is just the idea of transparency. Space gets classified almost immediately. And it's really hard. And people in the commercial sector work on space issues. They oftentimes have clearances, so they're constrained by the same limitations that governments have. And so it's really frustrating for me when we talk about, okay, we need to rethink how we view the space domain, how we deal with space security threats. You have leadership of Stratcom saying space is too classified. Stratcom saying space is too classified, and yet they can't get it unclassified, or at least the parts they want to. And so I think that's going to be a cultural change that needs to happen as well. But I think also we need to figure out ways in which to incorporate the commercial sector in these discussions. I will say the United States State Department is a leader in this in terms of bringing the commercial sector to the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is a branch of the United Nations that deals with civil space issues. They're really good about incorporating that. Not all countries are as effective, I think, as doing that. So that's a good start. But I think that it also requires the governments to understand they will need to get the commercial sector involved in the conversation. They can't just do it as a DOD or MOD or whatever you have sort of solution.
Actually, and since we do have some really great representatives from industry, Therese and Charity, we'd be delighted to hear from you all as well if you have any thoughts on that. My next question, actually, again to Apia. The European Space Agency is looking at space situational awareness, developing its own
optional program. Yes.
Right, it's one of the capabilities that they're working on, but there are also security elements tied to space situational awareness. Is the European Space Agency able to work on security issues, or is that something that will have to be dealt with in another department?
Well, that's a very good question. European Space Agency has actually a lot of research. It gets funded through the member states, and it has a lot of research made already or planned through these member states, and it is, of course, reflecting the interests of those member states as well. But as my perception is, I haven't seen many security-related missions. I mean, as many as, for instance, missions which relate to research or exploration of space, generally speaking. So I would say, I'm not saying that they're not dealing with security. I'm just saying that I wouldn't say that it's more than the other aspects. So it's definitely less.
Okay. Dins.
Thank you, Daniel. Ralph Dins-Dinsley from Northern Space and Security. It's just a point to add to that about ESA and security. In the past, the European Defence Agency has actually provided the security support for space research for ESA.
Excellent. Thank you. Audience, please. Any questions? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep running with this.
Hey, Daniel. initial point was contrasting the idea that safety is about the absence of intent, but bad things can happen. And then we get into the security realm when we begin to discern intent and all of that. But typically when we hear communications about, say, what has been classified as a potential attack on a satellite or something that is at least elevating concern, right? The provision of evidence is still being held very much into enclosed security realms and for the right reasons. So I'd just like to hear from the panelists about the importance of, open and transparent evidence provided, at least whether it's for safety purposes or what have you, and then how can the security community be a consumer of such information as opposed to being a provider of that information, because it really does change the nature of the dialogue, whether you do it in one direction versus the other. And I think that's kind of underlying the whole discussion right now is, does that direction of that arrow, which way information and evidence must move, have to change?
Jordan?
Yeah, I'll take first crack at that. No, I mean, you're 100% right, Brian. I mean, the idea of intent, how do you establish good intent? It's difficult. There are some ways you can do it. You can do it by sharing information, by transparency about your data sources. That's not always going to be the case, but you can be transparent in terms of sharing information about what your policies are. Share information about what your strategies are, share information about your budget. These are not things that happen in a vacuum. Sharing information about that, I think, helps demonstrate intent. Part of the problem I think the Western media has with Russian and Chinese space operations is that there's just not a lot of information out there on their policies, on their strategies, on their budget. They're very opaque. And so whenever they test anything, we just have to wildly conjecture what it actually means. And if there's more information, I know that transparency in China doesn't really go well together, but if they're more transparent, I think that'd actually be very helpful. But it's a long ways to go. And then I think, and again, the national security community does not help itself out by reflexively classifying everything. And that may have been helpful, maybe, or useful or doable a decade or two ago, but now when anyone with a telescope can go out and see an object in the sky, it doesn't make sense to classify that object's existence. Sure, maybe classify what it's doing, don't talk specifics, but at least acknowledge that it's there. The 2007 Chinese ASAT test. Do you know how the story broke? It wasn't government talking about it. It was a bunch of guys with telescopes in their backyards looking at it, being like, that object is there, and suddenly there's a ton of objects right here. And so they alerted reporters that they knew, and the reporters dug into it, and the Chinese took 10 days, and they finally said, okay, yeah, actually, we did have an ASAT test. Sorry, guys. And that was in 2007. Things have gotten better in terms of being able to detect these sort of things. So I think it is a time-past way of looking at things, and yet somehow the governments and the national security sector have not caught up and evolved to meet this current domain.
Mariel Borowitz from Georgia Tech. So I want to kind of pull on that same question in just a little bit more detail. So when we talk about transparency, what do you see as the priorities for transparency, the first information that we should be making available? What do you think is most practical for transparency, right? We may not get to the level of all the sensor data from DoD is just going to be out there, right? That's probably not going to happen. But what's a practical level? What are the priorities? And do you see the solutions coming from, right now we have Space Force taking over, do you see things getting better or worse with that new organization? Or should we be looking somewhere else? Should it be coming from commercial, coming from other nations, these first steps in transparency?
I keep talking.
Yeah, okay. I would try to give an answer with regards to, again, Romania. We have this interinstitutional working group on security and defense. And one institution, which is the space agency in this example, is moderating it, and all these intelligence, military-related institutions are invited at the same table, and then there is a process in which Romanian Space Agency informs them on whatever programs are going on, whatever legislation is happening, and they ask for feedback, they ask for the problems, they ask for really detailed information on what's happening in their structure, organizational places, and then we kind of all together from the same table we get to understand what's happening and what might be the problems, where all this process stops at some point, or what are the bottlenecks, or yeah. So I'm not saying it's a good example, but it's functional. I'm not sure it will be functional with industry as well, because we don't have much on that side. So it's mostly governmental organizations that are doing this exercise.
So, I mean, it's a very good question, how you prioritize and how you do it in a realistic way. I mean, the idea of making sure that the U.S. government should probably follow its own policy and releasing data that they said they're going to, that'd be a great start. But I mean, I think that the goal should be space flight safety, right? What is the basic minimum you need to have for space flight safety? You know, you should probably know where things are. That's probably the bar I would like to set on this. You don't even know what they're going to be doing. You don't even know maybe what they're going to be doing in the future, but just know where they are currently and be able to talk about that. So I think that's kind of, how do you achieve that? You know, one of the things the U.S. government does is we strike a lot of our national security satellites, our intel satellites, from the catalog. And we also agreed to strike some of our ally satellites from the catalog. Maybe stop doing that. Make sure the things that are actually up there are actually reflected in the catalog. In terms of who's going to be doing it, I mean, commercial SSA is not going to be our savior in this, because a lot of the commercial SSA operators have clearances and they have the U.S. government as their major client, and they're not going to want to rock the boat. So I don't think we can say, well, they can just give us information we already have. But I think other countries have SSA capabilities, and maybe we need to incorporate those in a larger discussion. But it's kind of confusing, because right now the U.S. SSA system is in a state of flux. We're changing who's going to be in charge. It's not going to be the Space Force, it's not going to be Space Command. In theory, it's going to be Commerce, if you compare the Space Presidential Directive 3. But when I talk to international people about that, they say, oh yeah, Commerce is in charge. Sorry, Commerce, that is a Space Presidential Directive, but Congress does not agree. Congress does not authorize the entire use of funding. Some people in Congress still want the FAA to do it. It's still not sorted. And so, I mean, it's probably likely it will be a non-military branch of the U.S. government in charge of SSA, but there will be, we're not sure who it's going to be yet. Until we figure out where it's going to be yet, it's hard to figure out the downstream effects of that. And I'm hoping when Kevin O'Connell speaks tomorrow, maybe he'll talk more about how that is evolving. But it is complicated.
And that's actually a really good point. It's a tangible thing that we can actually start working on, something that is actionable. Especially at the multilateral level, we have this terrible tendency to get quite esoteric and very hypothetical.
No.
And so actually having some priorities that we can look at and say, all right, if we can just work on sharing data that tells us not what the objects are, but just where the objects are, that's a step that people can actually focus in on and say, perhaps we can adopt some kind of a sharing agreement or something that is actionable and not just something that is very theoretical in terms of, and I know we often talk about this, but when we say like prevention of an arms race in outer space, there are so many still undefined terms in that sentence that it's very hard to focus in on some kind of a provision or an agreement that you can actually act on and work with and have a result that is in your hand. Right. So I think that would be a good priority.
Yeah, what Daniel's hinting to is that the UN has had the same discussions for decades. Decades, the same argument.
As old
for
as me.
Decades. It's all Daniel's fault.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's turning 40 this year.
Is it really?
It is.
Lord. And so they've been having the same, argument. Should there be some sort of legal treaty about space weapons? We can't define what a space weapon is. Well, you can't do this. You can't do that. It's against the United States. It's against Russia. So they've had the same discussion points for decades. And meanwhile, things are getting beyond us, and the space domain is evolving, and it doesn't reflect accurately the security challenges that we threat. And so, trying to figure out what are tangible things we can move towards. Non-legally binding responses could be actually very effective, because you don't have to get through the treaty process. And, treaties take a while to negotiate, and that's, one benefit is that you get everything pounded out ahead of time. But on the other hand, they take a while to negotiate, and sometimes you need to have something more active now.
Usually at the United Nations, we often see the major space powers having the most influence. But Olpia, I'll ask you, how can countries like Romania, that are not necessarily like really big space powers, what can these smaller, more modest space actors do in order to try and help improve the situation in space when they may or may not necessarily have the same interests as the Russians, the Americans, or the Chinese?
We actually participate to the missions. We participate to other countries which are bigger than us, and they have bigger space programs. So we participate financially, and with research, with expertise, and yeah, we don't own any satellite out there, but we have a space agency, and we are members of everything, more or less, what exists, and therefore we get to forward whatever we have to say in this way.
I think I saw another question over here.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say, at risk of sounding esoteric and hypothetical, I was going to ask actually about the multilateral development of the legal state of affairs, but you seem to sort of answer that question relatively comprehensively. I mean,
yeah, we're not getting too far at the moment. Things have come to a standstill again. You might know that in the last 2 years, the United Nations engaged in 3 space security efforts. There was the group of governmental experts on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. The Conference on Disarmament had a subsidiary body that was also looking at the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And the UN Disarmament Committee in New York set up a working group to look at voluntary transparency and confidence building measures. The group of governmental experts did not reach consensus at the very last second. As I'm sure many of you are aware, somebody broke the consensus, and it was, in fact, our host. The subsidiary body 3 was all the subsidiary bodies were unable to be reconstituted last year. They're going to try again this year, but there's high probability that they won't be able to do that again. And then the UN Disarmament Committee is not even able to meet formally because there are some political issues with visas. So if we can't even talk to each other about some very basic fundamental courtesies here on Earth, it's hard to start tackling the bigger issues in space traffic management. But that's why I think it's also really important to focus, to stop trying to wrap our arms all around this whole concept of an arms race in outer space, and maybe just look at some very specific issues that we might be able to address, and step by step, like the little ants, you eventually manage to haul the whole carcass away.
Daniel, my boss would kill me if I didn't step in at this point to discuss the long-term sustainability guidelines of the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. All right, so the UN splits up, as you may know, the UN splits up for space issues between civil and security space. Civil is Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Security is the Conference of the Disarmament First Committee, that sort of thing. The COPUOS has now 95 members. It's going to be higher than that. But last year, when they had 92 members, they reached consensus on a preamble and 21 guidelines to talk about the long-term sustainable use of outer space. These guidelines are not in any way groundbreaking. They're basically spelling out what's pretty much already being done. But when you think about 92 countries reach consensus, and these are countries like the United States, like Russia, like China, like Iran, that's pretty impressive. And so I think there is an ability to move ahead. There is some potential. Now, granted, the LTS guidelines in theory were civil in nature. They didn't handle security issues, but that division between security and civil space used to be very, and now I think the line's blurring just because it's blurring. You really can't divide between the two anymore. And so I think it does have potential for that. We'll see what happens with that. The big discussion now is discussing implementation. These guidelines are fantastic, but they're only as good as if countries are actually carrying them out. Are they doing it? Do they have the capacity to do it? If they don't have the capacity, what do we need to get them to get that capacity? And then there's a real, I think, split between the countries and COPUOS about what do you do next? Do you talk about the guidelines you couldn't agree on? Do you say, okay, we're going to keep the working group open and bring in new ideas as new issues come up we need to handle, and they're still working it out. But we'll see what ends up happening with that.
And I think it's also very important to note who your boss is and why he would want to talk about it. Dr. Peter Martinez, who is now the director of Secure World Foundation, used to be on the delegation of South Africa. And
he was the chair of the working group.
He was the chair of the working group for the long-term sustainability guidelines. I think the fact that he was coming from South Africa and that he was coming from a smaller space power, a more modest space power, really helped the credibility of that organization and of that group. And that's one of the areas that we see where countries like Romania, like Brazil, like South Africa can play a big role in trying to bridge divisions between some of the major space powers, but also the big space powers and the new space actors that are coming up. Because it's also important to remember that there will be other countries that want to get involved in space. It's not just the countries that we have now that get the free pass forever. And so as we make our uses of space more efficient, it enables other actors to come up later and to play a role there. And that's where I think it is very important for middle space powers to raise those interests and to bring up those discussions for those that have not yet accessed space.
I'm Mariel Borowitz from Georgia Tech. So, we talked earlier about how this is both a safety and a security issue, and now thinking about the diplomatic efforts that are going on, I'm curious to what extent are countries bringing in and engaging kind of the military leaders and the military thinking on these issues. So, we send State Department people to the UN to discuss these issues. Are they really tied in with the military priorities as well? And how about other countries also?
I mean, I can talk a little bit about the work we've done. It's tough because when you talk to other countries about space issues, they want to bring in their scientists. And the scientists are like, hey, we don't talk security. And so that's tough because how do you get the information up? And so we've been trying to, and also to be fair, a lot of these countries, they don't have a tremendously huge government infrastructure. They have one or two space people. They have to handle all the different aspects. And so then when we talk about capacity building, oftentimes the idea is you need to get those people, the diplomats and the scientists who go to the UN meetings, up to speed on these security issues. And sometimes that's actually, it's a longer road, but sometimes it's more helpful. We do a lot of work with UNIDIR and the CD and the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. And, disarmament folks like to handle things the way disarmament folks do. Basically for arms control, if something's a threat, you ban it. You get rid of it. You don't let people have it. Okay, well, if space security is a threat, how are you going to ban that? And so they tend to approach it with the tools they developed, which are maybe not as relevant or appropriate to these days. And so maybe it's more helpful to get the other work on the other side of the ratio on that. But it is a long way of doing. And we've been doing a lot of work internationally. We were in Singapore in January to talk to basically the countries of Southeast Asia about that. And there were in the room we were in, there were about 20 countries. And each country rep said, okay, this is great. I'm new to this. I was just told I had this as my assignment. Or, yeah, I go to COPUOS, but I guess we need to know space security stuff. So I think other countries are starting to recognize that they do need to have a security discussion. Historically, the idea has been that's a great power sort of thing. We're just trundling along using space for development. We don't need to get involved in security discussions, which is absolutely incorrect. Space security issues affect everybody's ability to use space. If there's any kind of space conflict, it's going to affect everyone. It's not just going to be the actors in line. And so Secure World has been working really hard to make these security issues relevant to all. So we're hoping that, again, it's going to be years, if not decades long process, but we're trying to see the groundwork now.
Okay, how do they handle it in Romania?
Well, I just answered to that question. We do have both military people and diplomats working together on the same table, but most of the time it's not working. So yes, at least there is a decent attempt to solve this issue. But as I said in my presentation, technology and also governance itself of these structures, it gets difficult at the very practical level.
Okay, now the audience is waking up. Come back to you.
Hi, Nadia Stoyanova here. I work for Scepter Analytics, and I'm a student at University of North Dakota. Back to the transparency and confidence building measures. And I'm thinking out loud here, but I understand you have to change the culture for something like that to become feasible as far as agreeing at the international level. But information leaks. And as part of my day job, I find things on the internet, and you have no idea how many times I would go out and do a job for a customer, and I would present it to them and go, where'd you get that? The internet, and at the same time, DoD has classified it way up here where only a few folks would have access to it. So with that said, commercial SSA sector is growing, and you have technology improving, you have social media is enabling amateur astronomers to go out and share, oh, look, I found a space plane. Oh, look, these two satellites are snuggling up next to each other. So how long will it take for the international community to stop being in reactionary mode and actually do something about it? Because, yes, we may not be able to agree on some kind of a legally binding treaty or voluntary information sharing, but the information is already being shared.
Is it?
Well,
So actually, and the reason I asked that, and T.S. Kelso's right here, so he can also point to this, and we've got exoanalytics. One of the things that was brought up earlier is the fact that Russia seems to get pointed at quite a lot for close proximity operations, but we don't really hear that much about it coming from the about the U.S. or about, well, China hasn't really gotten a lot of press lately.
They do.
But it's been less high profile than the Russians. But one of the reasons that is precisely because some of the American companies make it a policy, because they have to have certain clearances and authorizations, not to track anything that's not on the U.S. catalog. However, I think the other actors that could potentially shed light on that, such as Russia and China, if they were to share a lot more of their SSA information, then we might have a better view of what's going on. Unfortunately, I think our Russian colleagues are still pretty minimal on what they like to share. They certainly share with Mariba, so I know Astriograph gets some data from them. But in terms of what the Chinese can see and what they're tracking, I mean, good question. So I think one of the first things we have to work on is just being a lot more open with each other on sharing some of that information. Maybe not about what objects are or what they're capable of doing, but at least where they are. And once we get over that hurdle, then maybe we can start talking about a few other issues. But again, right now, tensions between the countries, especially some of the big powers, they're just not great. I mean, they don't even share each other's email addresses anymore. So it's even difficult just to communicate. So that makes it a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because, again, even at the lower level, at this level, at the conference level, where are the Russian and Chinese delegates? They're not here. They can't get visas. We have a couple of Russians. My organization co-sponsors a policy forum at the AMOS conference in Maui in September, which I'm sure many of you guys have gone to. And we've tried for years to get Russian and Chinese delegates there. And, one of the Russian guys said, look, I'm not going to do it because every time I apply, it's $150. I have to pay for it. My organization won't reimburse me unless I get my visa approved. And he keeps getting his visa denied. And he said, one year I got it the week after the conference started. And he said, okay, good, I can get it for next. I can at least go next year, because the visa is always 12 months. His was a special visa for 11 months. So he specifically could not go to the conference the following year. And so it's tough. You can't even begin to do the cross-pollination that you get by having people from different countries at these sort of things. I will say, the Secure World Counterspace Threat Doc, we talk about GSAP, Global SSA program, basically geostationary satellites that have SSA capabilities. We didn't get that information from the U.S. commercial sector. We got them from the Russians.
There you go. Charity, you got a question?
Hi, Charity Reedon from Astroscale. I'm going to give my comment in a format of a question. So, Victoria, you talked about all the stakeholders in space, and that has changed drastically over the past few decades. And Daniel, you talked about taking a bite one at a time to achieve the goal of space sustainability. Where are you seeing the progress on just the most basic of basic activities that governments could stop doing to reduce space debris, and that is ASAT tests? Do you, Daniel, especially for you, is there word on the street of an ASAT ban? And if so, can you talk more about that? Thank you.
Thank you for the setup. As some of you may know, I have been banging on the ASAT test ban drum for about the last 2 years. And actually, we are starting to see some traction that a number of states, including middle space powers, or not the big guys, have started actively discussing the possibility of ASAT test guidelines. So it would be a little bit lower than a ban. The idea that we've put forward is 3 principles in 5 words: no debris, low debris, notification. So no debris. If you're going to test an anti-satellite weapon in space, do not create debris. You can do a flyby, you can use a virtual target. There are a number of ways that you can demonstrate that your system works without actually generating more debris. Now, the next part is low debris. So if you have to hit something and you absolutely insist on it, do it low enough so that you don't leave any long-living debris behind. Okay, but what is that altitude? And we saw with the Indian ASAT demonstration recently that despite the fact that they did it at 280 kilometers in altitude, we still ended up with debris almost up to 1,000. And there's tons of debris around 400 kilometers where the International Space Station is. So I've had a number of discussions with Mariba about this, about what should be that lower limit. And he says, there shouldn't be a lower limit, it should just be no debris. However, the political side of things is a little bit more complicated, and there's one issue that we absolutely do not want to get into on this, and that is missile defense. We don't want to set a limit that will then create a barrier for missile defense to continue doing mid-course intercepts, which usually happens somewhere between about 100 and 200 kilometers. So at least for the moment, from a political perspective, we're saying for low debris, let's give it enough altitude so that you can still do some mid-course intercepts, and that should be the limit where you can generate some debris. That's it. And then notification. Tell somebody that you're going to be doing something so that people don't mistake it. I'm getting the flag that says time is up, so I think just enough time to wrap up. I'd like to thank Diane and Mariba and everyone else that has helped organize this event. My panelists, Lupia and Victoria and Maria, where you're out there. Thank you so much, and we'll see you after lunch.